Hey everybody, this is Tom from How to Quilt It here, and I am back with another vlog about a UFO. So back in 2014 I started a pair of twin size quilts that were going to be for our living room, and unfortunately they sat in a cupboard for the better part of 6 years, including moving house. So I finally got around to finishing these, and I started them back in June 2020, and they were in quite the state, having lived in a cupboard for so long, but they weren't properly stored, they were just flung in, so they were a bit of a mess. So this is the second quilt. The first one I finished, and I already have a multiple part vlog on my channel about this. So this one is just a zoom through montage of me going from the quilting through to finishing the binding. So what you saw at the start of the film was me just putting a little tester through the sewing machine to check the tension, to check that the thread was okay, and to check that I like the stitch length. And then now what you can see is that I am quilting away, and I am doing a straight line quilt pattern that's just a big series of giant L's. So this is a log cabin quilt, and this is made up of 3 colors. And what I'm doing is I've quilted a cross in the middle, and then I'm making L shapes in each quadrant of the quilt. And the lines are just spaced to the width of the strips in the log cabin that I'm using here. Now, funny story, those yellow gloves that I'm wearing are actually oven gloves. And I can't find my quilting gloves. I have a pair of quilting gloves and I cannot find them anywhere for the life of me. I have been looking now for 3 months and they have just vanished into thin air. So the only thing that I had left that I could use was these oven gloves. So they are clean, they're not really used very much for the oven as we have other oven gloves, but these are actually quite good for quilting with. So you can see what I'm doing is that as I sew down, I get to the point where I'm at the corner and then just pivot, taking out safety pins as I go. And you can see there's a few threads and things on the way that are just picked out and just, tidied up as we go. And I'm just stitching in the ditch here on the whole thing. So what you'll see is that when there's no ditch to stitch and the thread is very visible because I'm using a very light coloured thread, but when it is in the ditch, I'm trying as hard as I can to stay in that ditch. What I also like about doing this is the fact that I can start off the edge of the quilt top and then sew off the edge of the quilt top on the other side. And what that means is there's no threads to hide because they're all caught on the outside of the quilt and they can just be secured when I sew the binding on. Now another thing what I'm doing here that isn't really obvious in the film because it's only a close-up shot is that I'm sewing in different directions every time I turn the quilt. So the first one I'll sew left to right and then I'll turn the quilt and sew right to left. And what I'm trying to do is spread any puckering or gathering of the fabric across the direction so we don't get a big gathering of fabric. Now that did happen to me in the first quadrant that I sewed of this because I sewed them all in the same direction without realising. But when I started in the second quadrant, I realised my mistake and started doing it this way, and it worked out much better. And you can see that there's no puckering or gathering there. Now this is like 750% speed and it looks like it goes pretty quickly, but in real life it actually went pretty quickly as well. I had quilted this entire quilt top in about 45 minutes, which isn't very long. And I wasn't sewing particularly fast. I had my Bernina set at around 50%. And I was using quilting stitch 1325 at a stitch length of 3.5. Different angle here, just showing me squeezing that quilt through the throat of the machine and then turning and getting into a big mess. This is one of the reasons why I can't wait to have a long-armed quilt machine at some point in the future, because not having to deal with that big ball of fabric and shoving it backwards and forwards, as you can see, it's obscuring the camera angle. It actually gets really tiring on the shoulders. I don't know if that's just me or if it's everybody, but I find my shoulders get really tired, like pushing and pulling that big top around. And this is only a twin size quilt. I cannot imagine doing a king size quilt on a sewing machine like this. I know people do it because I've watched many videos on YouTube where they quilt, you know, king size tops on a domestic machine, but man, it must have strong muscles, like. I've also got the Bernina dual feed going as well, acting like my walking foot. I really like the dual feed, it's brilliant for pulling all those layers through at the same time. Not sure if it directly replaces a walking foot because of how it works, but it certainly does make a difference. You know, maybe one day I'll get a walking foot to try out, but you know, at £110, that's not going to be for a wee while, I don't think. The fabric looks really bobbled and fuzzy, but it's not. The fabric is just totally covered in fluff, which is on the quilt top. And what I will be doing is that I will be washing these because they are out of the cupboard and have been in the cupboard for 6 years, and then were in storage for about 4 or 5 months whilst I was moving house, and then sat in the cupboard again. So I could have washed them before I started quilting them. However, they would have ended up unraveling at the edges, so I thought it was better to finish the quilt and then wash them afterwards. So now this is a different day, and what I'm doing here is I have all my 2.5 inch binding strips cut. I needed 7 to make the binding for this quilt, and I am just trimming the selvages off here, lining them up on the lines on my board. I'm cutting 2 strips at a time. Then I just poured water all over my cutting board and the quilt that's sitting on the chair underneath. So, you know, great excuse to clean my quilting mat. So just getting rid of the quilting mat, setting up the sewing machine, changing to my new quilting foot that I just got from my sewing machine, the 97D. So it has a little bit of the extra wide foot on the left hand side, which I got as a tip from Quilting in the Valley's YouTube channel about how these Berninas pull the fabric through, and that the feet are slightly smaller on top when you're using the 1/4 inch feet. So I have the 97D on there. I'm just changing to a 7010 needle, I believe, because I had a quilting needle in before. There's my Aurifil thread that I've just recently started using, which I really like, and that's in beige. And that's a 50 weight thread, so nice and fine. And I've got a little guide there at the side of my foot, which just helps to keep the fabric feeding through. And I'm just, again, using a leader just to test the tension on the machine. So now I'm placing the strips together and I am sewing them with a 1/4 inch seam to join them to make one long big binding strip. Taking great care to make sure that I sew them the right way and that all the seams are on the right sides, because there's nothing worse than sewing loads of binding strips together and then finding out you've sewn one of them right in the middle the wrong way around. You can maybe see it in the background there are some scraps of fabric from an upcoming video series I'm working on that's going to be really exciting. I was trying to be really organised and cut all them all together. So this is me just checking that the seams are all in the right direction. So now we're attaching the binding to the quilt. We're so close to being finished, and this is on another day. I think this is the next day actually. So I had trimmed the quilt top up, and I'm just attaching the binding using a 1/4 inch seam here. So I attach it to the top of my quilt, and then I fold it over and stitch in the ditch on the top to attach the back. Now you can see I'm doing a mitered corner. So what I do is I sew to a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I backstitch, cut threads. I then fold my mitered corner, place it down, and then start sewing again. I've now put one of those gloves back on to help me because my hands were sliding all over the place and I was finding it difficult to keep that quilt straight. So here again, I've stitched to a 1/4 inch away, back tack, cut thread, folded, and then put down, and then off we go again. You can see there's still lots of threads on this quilt. They will be dealt with. This is corner number 3. I also backstitch when I'm starting on the corner after I cut threads. Some people start a 1/4 of the inch in from the edge of the quilt after they've turned it, but I just start from the edge and I haven't really noticed a difference. I think it may be a personal preference thing. So this is the last corner. And what you can see is I started in this corner, so I'm going to stop in a minute and I'm going to backstitch and I'm going to leave myself tails. Now I'm going to do a proper video on how I do this, but there are many different ways to join your binding. But the easiest thing I do is I lay the shortest one down and then the longer one on top. I measure a 1/4 inch past the edge and then cut so that there's a 1/4 inch overlap. I then put the sides together so that the mountains of the folds of the binding are touching. I use clips or pins and then double check that that works before I sew anything. Then I take it to the sewing machine, fold the quilt up to make it easier to manage, and then I sew those two strips together with a 1/4 inch seam. I press that seam open and then join the seams together and then check that it's laying flat, which it was. Back stitch at the start and then join that last little bit to the quilt and you can see it lays lovely and flat. Nice and flat, perfectly works. So that works for me and I will do a video about how I do that. So now, this is something that I just started doing that I didn't used to do before. I just used to hand kind of finger press the binding and then attach it over, but I noticed it wasn't very even on the back, which I didn't like. So what I've started to do is I've started to iron the binding open, including just folding those corners over and kind of setting the seams and then opening it up. And then what I do is I go back, once I've done this, and I actually iron the binding in half. So you're going to see that in just a second. So here I am, I'm ironing the binding in half, just kind of massaging around those corners, not really ironing them so they don't get stuck, but just ironing that in half all the way around the quilt. It's kind of hard because the quilt keeps slipping off the edge of the ironing board to show you, but just iron it in half and that creates a nice crease. And you can see I come to the corner, I kind of half fold the mitre and iron it, but I don't really finish it. It doesn't take long, but you do have to watch your fingers for the steam. Don't burn them. Almost finished. So now what I'm doing is I've got that pressed fold that I'm using as a guide and I am just pushing it over the back of the quilt and then using wonder clips to hold it in place, and I'm just trimming random threads and things as I go. And these wonder clips just help to hold it in place. It kind of stays in place anyway because it's been ironed in half, but it just gives me a little bit of extra security to know that it's not slipping about. And when I get to the corners, I'm just mitering them and then adjusting them to make sure that they're a nice angle. And this goes really quickly, it doesn't take long at all. I think this took me about 5 minutes. Just trying to watch one's posture though, so one doesn't crick their neck forward and, you know, get sore shoulders. Got those scissors sitting open, that's a hazard waiting to happen. And then we're back to the start. So now, as I said, I like to put mine on the front and then fold it to the back and then stitch in the ditch on the front to attach. And what I do is I start off just a little bit back stitching and then sew down. I've changed feet as well so that I can use the line in the middle of that foot to go down the ditch. And I just sew down with the regular 2.0 stitch length using normal piecing thread, just checking every now and then to make sure that I have caught the back and that there's no pieces that are hanging off. Take the clips off and I keep a little bowl at the side of my sewing machine. I just deposit them in as I get rid of them. And you can see I'm just checking to make sure that I caught the corner there. When you get to the corner, I just take it slow, sometimes using the hand wheel on the sewing machine to get right into the corner, not taking a stitch into the binding. And then I stop with my needle down, pivot the quilt round, and then off you go again. Cutting a little thread there. Coming up to another corner now. So you see that I kind of slow down as I get to the corner, turn, and then the corner is nice and secure. It's dead easy. Now I know other people attach their binding on the back and then fold it over to the front and then attach it with the machine, or they attach it on the front and then fold it to the back and then hand stitch it in place. But I quite like stitching in the ditch. I think it's nice and neat and it's nice and tidy, and it's also nice and quick. You know, this isn't a quilt that's going for competition. This isn't a quilt that I'm particularly worried about people seeing, because there's lots of mistakes in it, because I made it when I was a beginning quilter. I'm just interested in getting it finished so that I can wash it, tidy it up, and then gift it to somebody. But it goes really quickly stitching in the ditch. I just using the little line on the foot as a little guide to try and line that up with the ditch, so it gives me something to kind of follow. Every now and then I just kind of wander over the line, but you know. So that was me finishing this UFO. I finally got it. Lovely mitered corners. So I hope that was enjoyable to watch, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.